Good evening, and thank you all for coming. It's a real privilege to be invited back to speak at the New York Studio School. The last time I gave a talk here, which was also the first, was I think about 6 years ago. And then I spoke about the silence of European painting and the ways in which that silence of painting shaped certain art museum practices over time. And in a sense, my topic today follows on that theme, even though it will seem to be very noisy, but there is a connection. I renamed the talk. It's not false advertising. The curator and the art museum in the world is what I will speak about. Because in this great school of art, for and of artists, I want to talk about two types of institutions that are critical to artists and to which artists are, of course, critical. And these are two types of institutions that find themselves pressured or even embattled on various fronts today. And one of these institutions is the art museum, and the other is the curator. So even though I changed my title accordingly, I'm still going to take you to the Rijksmuseum, I promise, but via a detour led by the figure of the curator. My casual claim that the art museum and the curator are challenged may sound like melodramatic whining, really. Art museums, after all, are doing brisk business in our country. New ones or franchises of old ones are popping up all over the globe. China appears to be building hundreds, if not thousands, of museums over the next decade. And as for curators, they seem to be everywhere and to curate everything these days. So what's the problem, you might say? When I say that the art museum is under duress, I am referring to a prevailing conception of the museum type that, looking around the room, most of us grew up with. And that type of the modern art museum crystallized out of the late 18th century transformation of the Louvre Palace in Paris into a public museum of meticulously preserved and tastefully displayed masterpieces. And that Musée du Louvre, that Louvre, became the model for national museums around the continent, and there are many, many provincial and municipal derivatives around the world. That type of museum came to be ever more carefully cared for by ever more expert connoisseurs who became ever more specialized curators. Although these curators were originally mostly men of independent means and amateurs of art who had grown up in and around aristocratic collections, or perhaps alternatively were men of the trade, the proliferation and growth of museums in the 19th century demanded and then produced a new class of museum curator with expertise in specific media and in what used to be called schools of art, like the Dutch School of Painting, the Italian School of Sculpture, and so forth. This European type art museum and its curator were adopted in the major cities of the United States from the 1860s onward. In fact, several leading European curators helped build America's great museums. And these types, the museum and the curator, became so familiar that by 1950, they looked inevitable, natural and essential to civic life as one knew it. While a certain whiff of privilege still might emanate from the mid-20th century curator, for the most part, he had become a professional type with a defined place in the museum. Now, this rise of the curator, this professional person, can be tracked in many ways. For example, here, when you graph the incidence of the term curator, as I did in Google Books, those Google Books that were published from 1800 to 2008, you see a rapid rise from about, I'm not sure that you can see this or that I can see this. Well, never mind, you can see it. From about 1850 to 1900, you see a rapid rise in the incidence of the term and steady further growth up to about 1970 when it sort of flattens out. It's one measure of the rise of the curator. In the 20th century, the curator became a product of the finest university departments of fine arts, which mushroomed right along with the museums in Europe as in the US. Okay, that is about the most reductive, crudest history of the modern art museum and its curator that I could have given you, but in its outlines, I don't think it's wrong. So, what is that modern type of art museum for? Here is one definition, or circumscription, and that is that the most crucial business of any art museum is acquiring the finest objects available, presenting them freely to the public, and preserving them for the benefit of generations to come. That sounds like a credible mission statement for an art museum in 1880, 1910, 1955, or perhaps, as is actually the case, 2013, when Martin Filler wrote these words in a review of Renzo Piano's extension of the Kimball Museum in Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas. He didn't like the extension much. He thought it was entirely unnecessary, but he was very happy that the museum hadn't done too much damage so that it could go back to what he called the most crucial business of any art museum. Now, this familiar understanding of the art museum's function as acquiring, presenting to the public, and preserving works of art depends on the central presence in the museum of the expert curator who conducts sustained research and maintains a certain retreat from the public, the better to develop and care for collections that are often referred to as his or hers. We all know that sort of usage. Here is a more or less authoritative description of what curators with a capital C do. It is with a capital C in the strategic plan of the Association of Art Museum Curators, an important organization of curators known as AAMC by acronym. And it states, as you can read, AAMC curators have a primary responsibility for the acquisition, care, display, and interpretation of works of art. It sounds very, very similar to Filler's description of the museum. But if you compare this statement to Filler's, you will see that the curators have perhaps been engaged in a little bit of mission creep. In addition to acquiring, displaying, and preserving or caring, 21st century curators interpret. I'm setting that aside for the moment, but their basic tasks are certainly the same as those that were already in place in a 19th century museum, if this is the definition of the 21st century curator. Now, so what is under threat here is, I think, the idea that an art museum derives its public value from a mission to acquire, present, and preserve works of art. That is the idea that's under pressure, along with the type of curatorship that was and is required for it. Underlying this conception of the museum that I've argued goes back to the early 19th century basically, are assumptions that works of art are intrinsically of public value because they provide us with knowledge about the past, great pleasure and insight in the present, and founts of creativity and learning that we will need in the future. These assumptions fueled the development of municipal museums, the great ones such as the Detroit Institute of Arts, whose fate will be decided, probably this very Friday, by a bankruptcy court ruling on the plan of adjustment for its home city of Detroit. That bankruptcy resolution plan includes a strenuously negotiated grand bargain that would safeguard the collections of the Detroit Institute of Arts, or the DIA, for the public in perpetuity. The DIA would become the owner of all of the assets it's been stewarding for a long time, in exchange for contributions made by a compact of foundations, the state of Michigan and other stakeholders to the city's pension funds. A deal was cut, and it looks that after a grueling year of discussions on the relative rights of the city's retirees, residents, and creditors in relation to those of stakeholders in the museum, it looks at, after all this harrowing year, as if the DIA will emerge intact. Intact, but that doesn't mean that we have business as usual when it comes to the modern art museum. Regardless of the eventual outcome, I think, in Detroit, the episode exemplifies daunting challenges to the idea that a great collection of art is necessarily a vital resource for culture and for all, by implication. reading the list of hundreds of works that were acquired by the city of Detroit before the Second World War, Van Eyck, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Matisse, great works of art from China and Africa, reading that list as we were encouraged to do in the process of this negotiation, induces acute nostalgia for a time when the public value of the arts was self-evident to governing elites, and time spent looking at art was considered valuable in its own right. It didn't need an argument in the 20s and 30s, really, to buy all that art. But neither melancholy nor indignation will be of any help to art museums as they face competing claims for shrinking resources, and these claims will continue to come. The national debate about whose rights were to prevail in relation to the DIA's art throws into relief the absence of public agreement that art collections manifest their value longitudinally over time as assets that unlock the past and serve as resources for an as yet undetermined future. On the contrary, there is growing awareness and talk everywhere that the tax-exempt status of museums amounts to public subsidies of considerable size. And with that realization come new demands of lower entrance fees or entirely free entrance, expanded opening hours and visitor services, and so forth. Instead of despairing over a lack of public understanding of the core mission of art museums, however, it may be more productive to ask how art museums can best make the case for their value, show how their offer is different from that of other institutions of education and culture, and draw out substantive connections between that offer and the concerns and interests of a changing world and society. I think that these tasks cannot be accomplished without the leadership of curators who constitute the intellectual capital at the heart of art museums. So in what follows, I will first consider the expanding definition of curator today, then ask one more time what art museums are for, and finally look at how curatorial practice in one museum, the Rijksmuseum, is responding to the challenges and new potentials of our globalized age. Part 1. When you trawl through the literature on curatorial practice, which is sort of amusing, mostly in the form of anthologies and blogs since 1990, you will find many entertaining and informative accounts of the origins and evolution of the word curator. Some interesting writing in this zone comes from the data curation community that museum curators and people like me often find hard to think of as curatorial. The lively Erin Kassane, for example, has called her fellow digital content strategists to order by alerting them to the long line of curators who predate them. She's actually a data curation person who says, wait a minute, this curating business has been around for a while. And she has written wonderful little histories of this, from the Latin curator and the curate of ancient and medieval practice, through the Renaissance cabinetier of wonders to the Enlightenment connoisseur and the 19th and 20th century curator, defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the officer in charge of a museum, gallery of art, library, or the like, a keeper, custodian, which is a little bit like that AAMC curator. Now, most of this literature, much of it very ephemeral, is intent on exploding elite notions of curatorship associated with art museums, while at the same time wanting it all and having some of the rigorous traditions of museum curatorship lend some cachet to curation nation. So they sort of want to have, both they critique the notion of the art museum curator, but it's also to say, look, we are like the art museum curators. In a way, we have that same kind of rigor and insight. Although talks like this, like mine, now routinely make fun of the pretensions of the barista who curates our venti soy skinny mochachinos and so forth, we make fun of that, right? The notion that curating is no longer the prerogative of the art museum may have been winning out for quite some time. So back to Google Books. This is a highly unscientific test, but I thought I'd run it. This highly unscientific slide gives a sense of the devaluation of the term curator with a capital C. It breaks down the graph I showed you earlier of the incidence of curator without sensitivity to case And it breaks it down, these percentages of Google books published since 1800, with incidence of the term curator in them, by whether the term is capitalized or lowercase. Now, you can see, I think, very easily, it's the red one here is the curator with the lower case, and the green one is with the capital. And sometimes it's entirely capitalized, but very few people did that. But you can see that right about 1980, the curator with the lowercase zooms up, and there's a precipitous decline in the status or the incidence of the curator with a capital C. And so one is on the rise, and the other one is in decline and has been for 3 decades, which surely has something to do with the arrival of the internet and the curation that goes on in it, along with curation in the contemporary art world, which has also come to refer to itself increasingly also in performing arts as curation with a lowercase c. I get the sense that you're not convinced, but if that slide didn't convince you, this comparative search may. Since 1995, curation, which is that blue line, has been beating curatorship with a capital C, or lowercase c, with no end in sight. What is sort of surprising, though, about this torrent of writing on the curator and curation, there's really a lot of it, is the absence of any sustained thought about the Latin root for these words, in cura, or which means care. Cura, with a capital C, the Roman personification of care, is the protagonist of a brief fable that was recorded by the Latin author Hyginus early in the Common Era, 1st century. The story of cura with a capital C has caught the attention of philosophers ever since Martin Heidegger made it a cornerstone of his thought about being in the world, what he called the human Dasein in German. It is such a delightful story, and it has such profound implications for curatorial presence in the world that I'm going to recite it completely. Here we go. Once upon a time, when Cura was crossing a river, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took a piece and began to shape it. While she was thinking about what she had made, Jupiter came by. Never fails, right? Cura asked him to give it spirit, and this he readily granted. But when Cura wanted to name this thing for herself, Jupiter forbade this and demanded that it be given his name instead. While Cura and Jupiter were thus arguing, Tellus, or Earth, arose and desired that it should have her name, since she had offered it her body. They asked Saturn to be the judge of this, and he gave them the following decision, which appeared just to them. He said, "Since you, Jupiter, have given this thing its spirit, you should receive that spirit at death. And since you, Tellus, have given its body, you shall receive its body at that time. But since Cura first fashioned this creature, she shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is a dispute among you as to its name, let it be called Homo, for it appears to be made out of humus, earth." Now, clever, huh? For Heidegger, this story was a precious document of common or workaday or pre-philosophical understandings of human being, of human existence as not autonomous over and against the world, the material world, but as arising in care, in cura. Heidegger, here's a little bit of German, Heidegger sees care as definitive of human being in 2 interrelated senses, that of Sorge, which means anxious effort or worry, and that of Fürsorge, concern or solicitude or caring for in the sense of dedication, dedicating oneself to something. And that is where our human being, he says, arises. Now, the primacy of care as a condition of human being in the world arises then in relation to the customary definition of homo, man, as a compound of earth and spirit, Jupiter and Tellus. This being has its origin in care, indeed, as the story tells us, because as the story tells us, it is owned by Cura, possessed of care and concern for as long as it lives. That sounds indeed very human, doesn't it? And Homo has no autonomous existence, no immaterial consciousness, and this was important to Heidegger too. Care owns Homo, but his name is not hers. His name is derived from earth, from humus. Now, as compromised as Heidegger's philosophy may be on many grounds, including anti-Semitism and Nazi affiliation, his reading of the fable of Cura seems persuasive about ancient Mediterranean and West Asian understandings of the human condition, or ways of dealing with that problem of why we are here and how we came to be conscious of our being. It's resonant of the myth of the creation of Adam, of course. The fable sheds light, too, on why the Judeo-Christian God had to cast our progenitors out of the Edenic paradise into the world. In the Garden of Eden, there was simply nothing for them to worry over or care for. Everything was taken care of. Hence, there was no way for them to be fully human or account for our experience of being human in the world. What does this have to do with the curator? The story of Cura, to me, seems to imply that curatorship could in some ways be thought of as our definitive and perhaps highest calling, the mark and condition of our being human. In this light, the care over things made by humankind, the curation of them after their makers or those who cared for them before us have died, appears a heady charge and perhaps an impossibly grave responsibility. But the good news about the story is that the care of things of human concern appears to be the birthright and charge of all of us, not those with the title of curator alone. And in this sense, there is opportunity rather than menace in the democratization of what it means to curate. Can art museums convince their communities that their curators' mandate to care matters, that the things they care about matter? And can art museums find ways for their communities to help their curators do so in a spirit of shared responsibility? Would all of us, in and outside the art museum, be better curators, carers in the end? Okay, so much for philosophy. What are art museums for? This part is going to be a bit more practical. If cura is the defining concern of human existence, is it reasonable to set art museum curators apart from all the others who care? One answer to that question could be that art museum curators are trained experts in fields of knowledge that are required for the safekeeping and constantly renewed understanding of objects that belong to all humanity somehow and therefore need and warrant our special protection. But that last claim can be made for lots of things that don't belong to art museums. The sort of answer I just gave then presumes an understanding of what makes the art museum a distinctive type of institution that does cultural work that is different from that of, say, universities, libraries, archives, or science museums, or even the trade. Without articulate and shared understandings of what art museums are, it would be impossible to think of art museum curators as a special subset of all of us who care in the world. And the question of what sets art museums apart requires thinking about what they are for. Maybe this is a way into this question. There's an old story about an art museum director. In fact, I heard it twice told about a different art museum director in the same year, so I assume it's sort of a myth, but it's a good one. Going around his museum with a group of major donors, this director stops in the gallery with the museum's finest paintings, pulls out a piece of paper, and reads a poem to the group. He tears up the piece of paper and asks the group if they can recite it. They do. They must have had a very memorable meter, something like Emily Dickinson or something, but still, it's pretty impressive. Gesturing then dramatically to a masterpiece, he asks, what if I were to pull this off the wall, light a match to it, and put the ashes out in the dumpster? The donors laugh a little uneasily because they get the message. The museum is the steward of an artifactual heritage that cannot be remembered or reproduced to its full or authentic effect in words. Ut pectora poesis non est. Like these donors, I find caring for humanity's great feats of designing and fabricating arresting objects a more than sufficient reason for having art museums. I grew up believing that. This function is not self-evident, however, to constituencies that are less self-selecting than art museum donors or art historians. In the normal run of life, after all, humans are constantly made aware of the transience of material things and have to more or less accept them, starting with our bodies, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the shelters we inhabit. It all deteriorates. Why then do we need institutions to single out some of the things we make, privilege them over others, and spend valuable resources preserving them? The long history of universities suggests that societies, by and large, favor and spend more resources on the preservation of verbal or quantitative modes of thought over artifactual knowledge. As the institutions that are charged to be the primary stewards, producers, and transmitters of knowledge, universities are overwhelmingly logocentric and quantitatively oriented. Nevertheless, as human beings, we also have a very long history of hedging our bets against physical transience by investing in texts, objects, and rituals that can place us in the memories of our peoples, the histories of our cultures and societies. Apparently, texts alone cannot serve this need for memory structures that transcend our individual lives. Huge swaths of human history, culture, and experience would be entirely inaccessible or incompletely available to us without the record of their art. This goes for all cultures without writing, like Cycladic civilization. It goes for cultures with writing that is yet to be fully decoded, like all of Egyptian heritage before the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone. It goes for cultures in which writing has only belatedly set down oral traditions, as for many tribal and nomadic societies even today. And it goes, as in the past, for any type of experience and reflection that cannot be adequately registered, or not yet in verbal or quantitative form. So this would argue strongly, I would say, for having art museums. So if art museums are then rightly preservers of this material part of our cultural history, it is not enough for them to collect paradigmatic works of art, conserve and research them, and document them in catalogues. They have a fundamentally public function, and this goes back all the way to the Louvre again. And that public function sets them apart somewhat from universities. Well, really a lot from universities, which are not as public as they could be. Universities, after all, evolved partly to stand back from society and offer space for reflection on their objects of study. That's often forgotten today, but that is a really important value of the university. In contrast, communities build and support art museums because they want access to the heritage they preserve, to the cultural memory that is stored in their collections and that can be revisited and worked with and thought about with their aid. But art museums are not just about filling in gaps in historical knowledge or about preserving images of objects either. If they're only about preserving sort of parts of our history and cultural memory, they could do so very well online, as many of them, of course, have begun to do. They could become digital libraries in the process. In fact, I think they have to guard for that a little bit. Any survey of visitors will tell you that people come to museums, at least in part, for what they perceive to be authentic encounters with works of art, and to have special social experiences in them around these encounters. That's at least some of the reasons people come to museums. These functions may be of renewed value and could be played up, in fact, in our digital age when a public debate has arisen about the dispersal of attention and lack of substantive conversations among digital natives and all of us older digital enthusiasts. I am not so negative about this, but that is a big topic in the discourse, of course. Works of art can be marvelous defensive armaments in the struggle for attentiveness, because they are designed to hold it, after all, and focus our minds in particular ways. If we understand works of art to be objects that by their design and their manufacture make us experience them consciously as objects, they are wonderful things to think with. Museums can play this up, it seems to me. The twinned responsibilities, then, that make art museums distinctive and necessary are the preservation of the fullness of history and the staging of aesthetic encounters with objects that give access to the thought and experience of human beings from times and places other than our own, even if it is the next neighborhood over or, a year ago. By themselves, these preservation and presentation functions still won't guarantee the relevancy of art museums, however, because an art museum probably won't thrive in the long run unless local communities consider themselves to have stakes in their mission and want to take care of them. To ensure that understanding of mutual dependency and benefit between the museum and the community, museum curators are in fact partnering as never before with the educators and community engagement specialists to whom these tasks were traditionally assigned or relegated. For a curator today, that may mean having to pay disproportionate attention to what is powerfully distinctive in her collections, even if that weight is not a primary research interest or area of expertise for that curator. It also may mean that the curator must rethink hard an inherited approach to staging those collections in galleries and exhibitions. And perhaps it means jettisoning the medium or period-specific approaches that he learned en route to his curatorial role, the way graduate programs still, for the most part, prepare art historians. It may mean the curator has to solicit thoughts and responses of community partners about the objects about which the curator is the undisputed expert. It means having to listen to all sorts of things that may at first brush sound a little uninformed or perhaps downright idiotic. The curators have a hard time these days, In London, but precisely those kinds of conversations can have startling effects and perhaps sometimes give you new sorts of access to your own collections. In London, at a wonderful little museum known as the Hornemann Museum, I don't know if you know it, it's about 120 years old, in South London, the curators of the African Worlds Gallery in that museum did this to startling effect when they consulted the community of people of Yoruba heritage and other cultures of Africa in London. They really just brought the people in and had them look at things and, of course, discovered this tremendous variety of Christian, Muslim, various kinds of tribal interpretations, and started working with them to try to create a display where they could draw on some of this local knowledge. Now, as a result, here are a few pictures from the Hornemann Museum. This African Worlds Gallery doesn't look a whole lot like the way it would look in a museum of great masterpieces, even though that museum has some very fine objects of African art. There are unusual decisions that were made. For example, it's somewhat unusual to have ancient Egyptian with sub-Saharan work from much later date in one and the same gallery looking at each other. So there was kind of this assumption that we're looking at things from Africa. We're not starting from some essentialist notion of what is African, which their people had encouraged them to do. You see also mixtures of the very contemporary with that great huge mask, Igbo mask at left with much more older sort of 19th and early 20th century material. And you see a lot of thinking about the diaspora and what does it mean to be from Africa, which is an interesting question for an African person from Africa living in London. And so you have here in this set of displays that these school children are looking at, you have mixtures of Benin altars, Haitian altars, and altars local in London today. So, this doesn't look like the African Art Museum as you might have known it, or gallery, but to the people who come to this delightful place, there is a lot to connect with and think about for oneself, even if to a traditional curatorial eye, the display will pretty much look like a mess. Part 3. Here is one of those more traditional museums, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which offers an example of how a team of curators in a more traditional museum has rethought the challenges and opportunities of staging art in art museums today. The Rijksmuseum is both a magnificent international destination and an intensely local museum dedicated to the art and history of the Netherlands. Over the course of the 20th century, the museum opened late in the 19th century, over the course of the 20th century, The museum built deep curatorial and conservation expertise, and in parallel, an education department that handled the increasing flow of tourists and school groups in relative isolation and sometimes in outright battle with curatorial concerns. In 2004, this great museum closed for what was to have been a renovation campaign of a couple of years. Soon bogged down by internal debates over curatorial direction and by external conflicts with the bicyclists of Amsterdam, and I assure you, you do not want to mess with these people. That was a mistake. But bogged down in all this, the rebuilding took a decade and at least double the original budget provided by the Dutch state for the most part. So there was a lot of kvetching, a lot of concern, a lot of debate and so forth and complaining, but all this fracas seemed to have been forgotten at the huge national celebration in full color and orange that followed the museum's reopening a year ago by then Queen Beatrix. It was her last official act of state, was to open this museum. What can we learn from the new Rijks? And before I start taking you through and talk about this, I want you to just to say, if you haven't been yet, go. It is a really, really interesting place to go see, and it is quite fabulous. So what can we learn from the new Rijksmuseum? What is it about? This is what the lively new website tells you to expect. For the very first time, visitors can follow a chronological journey through the collection and experience the sense of beauty and time this offers. In a sequence of 80 galleries, 8,000 objects tell the story of 800 years of Dutch art and history. The story of 800 years of Dutch art and history. It is a compact distillation of the Rijksmuseum's mission. What you will encounter are objects. They tell you about art, and they tell you about history. They tell you about time, and they tell you about beauty, history, and aesthetics. And the story is local. It is about things Dutch, to a fault perhaps, and it extends through time. Here then, in quick synopsis, are 4 noteworthy features of the new and unquestionably improved Rijksmuseum. I will talk about some of the losses too, but it is improved. Let me just orient you a little bit. This drawing gives you the overview of the original building. This is the original corpus of the building that was added onto over time, but this was the original corpus. If you have been there, you know that the night watch is right there in this little area right here. And the building has 2 courtyards that you see here covered in glass. And essentially it's like a figure 8, right? The old entrances were at the other side in the back. You may remember if you've been there. And here's a tiny little building, the Asian Pavilion, that was added, the only really new piece of building that was added by these architects, Cruz y Ortiz, the Spanish architects. So the first noteworthy feature is to say that the museum decided to restore its historic building that was designed by Pierre Cuypers, rather than to build serious extensions to it. This is a rare thing in this day and age. They didn't build a new building. The museum opted to remove, clear up, and streamline the building, not to make the project cheaper, far from it, it made it more expensive, but to make it more transparent, brighter, and more suitable to looking at objects. The museum valued the architecture as the biggest object in its artistic and historical collections. The architects, Cruz y Ortiz, restored Cuypers' original intentions for the courtyards to serve as huge light wells for the surrounding galleries, which are laid out in that rectangular figure 8 plan I showed you. These courtyards had been glommed up in the 1960s to create room for airless galleries, offices, and other back-of-house functions. You'll remember, if you remember going through the galleries, you could get endlessly lost in there. Here you see a little plan of the second floor. The 2 halves of the 8 are divided and connected by a spine. Here in Dutch, sorry, by a spine that contains a so-called Gallery of Honor, which has long served as the approach, the ceremonial approach to the night watch, which is surely as close to a true national monument as the country possesses. So here is the front hall, and you go through these galleries that are very open opposite each other, and the night watch awaits you there. This Gallery of Honor, as it is called, sits on top of an underpass that you see here, which is the bicycle run connecting the central and southern parts of the city, which I urge you to be very careful to crossing. These courtyards, you're looking into one of the courtyards from the other, are connected by an underpass under the underpass that you see there on the 0 level, where you can buy tickets, check codes, and find restrooms. Visitor services have been vastly improved from, they had next to none. They hadn't invented the term yet before. Now, these limpidly clear spaces, these courtyards, figure as monumental welcome signs, functioning as public squares, bringing light into the galleries and airing out the enclosed sense of the museum's past. If there is one complaint, it would be that there is almost too much void here. These are huge spaces, a condition that the museum has begun to address with temporary installations that articulate and enliven the space, as with this great Calder stabile that was there this summer. Okay, so architecture really, they exerted restraint and they worked to create greater clarity for the public. That also has been, I would argue, to the good of the art. This is the second point. The museum's installation aims for chronological clarity and integration of artistic content and historical context. The chronological clarity is a time-honored curatorial principle, of course. The integration of artistic content and historical context is a really new thing for the museum. In the presentation, the distinction between works of art and historical objects is no longer emphasized. And arguably, of course, it is always a bit of an artificial and relative distinction that evolves over time. You get to make your own judgments, but every one of those 8,000 objects on display, whether you think of them as historical document or aesthetic thrill, is pretty great. Each of the 4 floors in the museum lets you enter a different era, and you feel it. Medieval and Renaissance, and a host of special collections on ground 0, from which this slide is taken. The 18th century here with the wonderful Meissen they have, and the 19th century here in a pretty classic 19th century display in the 2 halves of the first floor. You see the integration of these objects and paintings. And then on the second floor, the so-called Piano Nobile, really, the floor of honor that has that gallery of honor in it, you have the entire is entirely given over to the 17th century with a full integration of paintings and objects in the way that I'm showing you. And then, and this is unfortunate, on the top floor you have some cramped sort of suite of attic galleries, garrets really, whose piecemeal dip into modernism and its discontents is thoroughly unsatisfying. And it is in fact worth asking whether the Rijks should not leave that century to the nearby Stedelijk Museum. It's a stone throw away, a great museum of modern art, or rather at least collaborate with it. You could put artist studios in here, it would be very interesting. Okay, that said, on each of the 2 pre-modern floors, a palpably different shape of time emerges from the varying densities of display, the preponderance of particular types of materials and objects for an age, and gently enforced storylines. They're really very gentle storylines, I'm happy to say. I was very worried about that before. And here you see the 19th century in sort of a salon-like hang. Captions are short and mercifully sweet, or rather I should say mercifully short and for the most part sweet. And they seem neither condescending to visitors nor indulgent of scholarly excess. Technology is just about absent. It's something that you can get on your cell phone if you want, or you can go home and look at your online. But it is really the objects tell the story, the labels are short and just give you some basic information. One's sense of being in an epoch is enhanced by the different shades of gray on the walls, which are chosen for particular periods. Most of them seem to be a hue of anthracite that sets off most paintings and objects wonderfully well. Accomplishing this spatialization of unfolding time through objects required the full integration of the Rijksmuseum's collections of paintings, prints and drawings, history and decorative arts, which had traditionally been separate. And this is undoubtedly what made it take so long, because the Dutch have this polder model of decision-making where everyone gets a say. Can you imagine having to do this and integrate these massive collections the territorial divisions that had to be overcome. It must have been absolutely incredible, and they must have thrown a lot of psychological care at it. But it paid off. Where the museum used to have a history section dedicated to political and cultural history, and also much larger sections of paintings and of decorative arts, and kept them separate, it now offers a flowing and integrated parade of cultural history with an evident pinnacle in the 17th century. This integration took massive curatorial realignment. By the account of all, it was not easy, but the curators did let themselves be drawn out of their silos and for the most part accepted the opportunity to re-envision their roles together. Now, the third feature. Despite this integration, the Rijksmuseum still foregrounds its greatest strengths and draws visitors to them with enhanced force. And I think that's a good thing. Dutch painting of the Golden Age, the 17th century, reigned supreme, as in any international context it should. This was a great art. And so the century occupies that main floor I already showed you, divided a little too neatly into first and second halves of the century by this gallery of honor that is the spine. And that grand hall, again, where you, that you can walk through like this to the night watch, that grand hall is exclusively about painting and the greatest of it. Hals, Vermeer, Steen, Ruysdael, Sanverdam, and of course, Rembrandt. This processional hall, as you saw here, you could see it here, it's flanked by these pairs of large cabinets, open rooms, three-walled rooms on either side, that are framed by restored Westminster-style decoration that, from the 19th century that calls out to great artists and places of Dutch history. I find it a little overdone, but you know, nevertheless, it's historical. These spaces, though, I would say, you can see that, are almost too large for the lineup of 4 Vermeers, as you can see. In the 19th century, these rooms were fitted with heavy curtains to create a sense of privacy in the cabinets and ceremonial pomp in the march to the gallery's focal point in the night watch, in the room that was specially built for it early in the 20th century, looking quite grand as here. Maybe they should bring the curtains back. There's a lot of sound coming in and out of those galleries. The fourth feature and last is about the public standing and mission of the institution. Having overrun its budget of $200 million or euros by some 300, can you imagine? The Rijksmuseum is atoning with aggressive public-mindedness. They were closed so long. The museum's main buildings are now dedicated entirely to its public-facing work. There isn't a curatorial or conservation office in this building. Security, that's it. While the museum was closed, the curatorial and conservation and registrarial functions were moved to nearby buildings, some repurposed, some newly built. The new openness, this new turn, represents a sea change from the museum's 20th century culture, which was as standoffish as the long waits in the drizzle, always drizzle, outside 2 narrow entrances that went up steep stairs. The museum is now open all days except Christmas, and it has helpful staff stationed at every turn saying, "Hello, good morning, have a nice day." This is new. It has good signposting and an attractive brasserie that features cookies from each of the 12 provinces. I never knew we had different cookies for the 12 provinces, but it's a cute thing. It has a smart-looking store that separates the tchotchkes from the many, many books. There are many, many books. And it has well-advertised access for all to come to this library and the print study room, or at least to gawk at it. There are new plans to create a visiting center and open storage cabinets in the off-site storage facility and transportation to it. The website is informative in many languages and provides free access, entirely free for any purpose, to high-quality, downloadable images of any of the works in the collection that it has already digitized, and that are many of those, for any purpose, commercial or scholarly. Website visitors are encouraged to create their own Rijks studios online and design new products with the images. In fact, the first annual Rijks Studio Award was won by a pair of young designers for their creation of the makeup line Rijks Muse. I haven't tried it yet, but it seems a cute idea. The museum still charges admission, 15 euros for adults, but it is free for anyone under 18 and for holders of the Dutch Museum Year Card, which is a steal for anyone intending to visit any museum 4 times per year, even as a tourist. You make your money back. So how is it going so far? Here you have the director at left, Wim Pijbes, and Taco Dibbets, the chief curator, sort of caught surveying the scene. By most accounts, visitors are having a fantastic time in the new museum. The free opening day drew 20,000 visitors, maximum capacity, and the first month attracted 300,000. These numbers have kept exceeding the museum's most vigorous projections all the year since. On return visits, I've been paying close attention to how people are looking at things, and I've eavesdropped on their conversations. I've tried to dodge the selfies, of course, but other than that, there's a lot of looking that goes on. I'll just sort of show you some of these images in the medieval gallery here, of course, Rembrandt, the 17th century, Rembrandt. I hope these images suggest that despite the historical reorientation of the installation, the aesthetic power of the museum's objects appears unaffected by the occasionally wild mix of media and sometimes range of artistic quality within single galleries. People lean in. They kind of bump their noses into it. It's happened to me, into the nearly invisible glass. It's beautiful. In these vitrines to scrutinize silver and glass that they would have been hard-pressed to find in the old museum. They would simply not have seen it. And they seem to delight over personal connections that are drawn out between objects and paintings, which one can do so well with Dutch art, as in the case of a portrait of a legendary Dutch admiral, which you see here on the wall, very near a model of the sort of ship that he commanded, the warship he commanded, and just right by there, these 2 objects in a vitrine that have his very own personal letter holder and a special sort of goblet that he was awarded by the States General after his victory, Michiel de Ruiter. Visitors seem curious, too, about an odd assortment of whalers' hats in a gallery dedicated, I think these are really hipster-looking myself, and whalers' hats from the 18th century in a gallery dedicated to the interactions of art, economic dominion, and political empire in the Dutch colonial past. These were found, frankly, buried with their owners on Spitsbergen. So it's just an amazing sort of personal view. The personal quality of these types of objects, worn on the body or handled in daily life, brings home the glorious as well as the brutal realities of seaborne dominion, which is stressed also in many displays of these sorts of shipping models and so forth. Now, for historians of Dutch painting, like me, who still think that the Frick is the perfect museum, there are losses. You have to choreograph yourself deftly around chests and chairs sometimes to get a good look at some Dutch paintings, and fewer of them seem to be on view than before. As a member of the art historical tribe, however, I can always have access to those pictures for myself or for my students and study the extraordinary Dutch creation of a new type and system of painting by other means. By the evidence of visitor interest, the museum made the right call to privilege the broader curiosity of the many over the critical or scholarly interests of the few. The integration of media, here 3 views of the medieval and Renaissance galleries. In these galleries especially, it is a riveting success, evocative in density, variety, and visual echoes among objects, of the visual cacophony and richness of church interiors before Reformed action in Holland stripped them bare. This is an act of restitution that I think is very important in the museum. And the decorative arts and artifactual history at large look fresh in installation art type displays of ingenious feats of things like locksmithing. Here, this hangs opposite a bunch of locks. Or, of course, as we've already seen, these spectacles of bonnet making. The presentation of sculpture in the round, often outside vitrines in a very exciting way, has gained in ways that will only unfold as we settle into this new presentation. So does the Rijksmuseum then fulfill the mission of art museums? The materiality of history here certainly receives its due, and the museum has revived the aesthetic encounter that was made impossible in the claustrophobic 20th century quarters. Peter Sheldall's review in the New Yorker of the Brighton Museum emphasized this gain rightly. About the Night Watch, which he called one of the two best paintings ever made, the other was Las Meninas, and which he called a raft for the self-respect of Western civilization, he exulted, "One of us did that." His exclamation point captures that uncanny experience of meeting across time and cultures an object of stunning design intelligence and skill that was made by someone nonetheless with our own biological and physiological apparatus. And I think that that kind of experience is now available again in the museum, and visitors to the museum frequently seem to be gobsmacked in this way. In theory, all people should have access to such mind-expanding confrontations. Can they, is a good question. My recognition of Sheldall's response, "Of course he's right," made me uneasy. His "one of us" implies actually an us on the receiving end who are prepared to recognize the work's power, and how many are really included in that us. In concerning itself with the works of some of the few great talents in history, can the art museum really help all the rest of us care? Here the Rijksmuseum faces very similar challenges, unexpectedly, to those encountered by most museums in America today. Although the Rijksmuseum is ostensibly a museum for all denizens of the Netherlands and a record of their shared history and art, that country and the people who call it home today no longer look remotely as they did when the Rijksmuseum was founded, or even when I grew up in the country in the 70s. By conservative census estimates, about 79% of Dutch citizens identify as Dutch in an ethnic sense. They call themselves Dutch. Together, at least 10% of Dutch nationals, and probably many more who are included in the 79% who call themselves Dutch, are of Indonesian, Turkish, Moroccan, Surinamese, and Caribbean descent, among others. Although the majority of the 79% who call themselves ethnically Dutch refer to these people I just mentioned as allochthonous, which means from elsewhere, those folks are in many ways from here. And they're not going anywhere, at least they're not planning to. And in a country where the majority of the population identifies as no longer religious, they call themselves literally irreligious, 7% today is Muslim. The Rijksmuseum is more forthcoming, it recognizes this, and it is more forthcoming than it had been about darker aspects of Holland's colonial past, which in some ways account for its riches. But the grandeur of the Dutch seaborne empire continues to sound the dominant notes in this display, with colonial histories present, but relegated to more distant galleries, where you get a fair number of dutiful pictures, like this view of the Dutch fort and market at Jakarta, which they called Batavia. Arts of Asia provide a fine counterpoint to the Dutch material in Ortiz Cruz's new Asian pavilion, which I showed you from the outside before. It is a most attractively installed jewel box for the Asian objects that the Rijksmuseum did begin to collect in the early 20th century. Not a single work or text in this gallery, however, would let a visitor come away with an understanding that Islam is one of the largest religions on the continent of Asia, or that the former Dutch colony of Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. It is never, these words don't even appear anywhere in these galleries. So Asia is figured through objects from Hindu, Buddhist, and secular contexts. That's it. More troubling elsewhere in the 19th century galleries is this, this is again still the very beautiful display, Shiva dancing. More troubling is this sort of jammed vitrine in the main building in the 19th century gallery, which shows you jewelry and gems from the so-called Lombok Treasure. Although the name Lombok Treasure sounds fabulous, right? Something dug up by archaeologists like the treasure of Atris. The label you see and can read here acknowledges that this was war booty taken in 1894 by Dutch soldiers in a large military intervention in a local conflict on the island of Lombok. Thousands of Balinese soldiers died in combat, and then committed ritual suicide after defeat at the hands of the Dutch. Much of the silver was taken directly off their bodies. For much of the 20th century, the rich grab, there's much more than this is just a tiny little piece of it. The rich grab was a beloved attraction for visitors to the Rijksmuseum for ethnography, of all things, in Leiden. Dutch citizens protested loudly when, in 1977, the government answered a decades-old plea from the Indonesian government and returned most of the objects to Jakarta. The caption to some of the remainder now on display in the Rijksmuseum, but you have by now been able to read, doesn't begin to get at this problematic story or its recent, very productive aftermath of collaboration between Dutch museums and the National Museum in Jakarta, which, contrary to Dutch anxieties at the time, has been taking meticulous care of the objects ever since their return. A fuller representation, which I think would be a good thing, of the shared histories of the Netherlands' heterogeneous population is limited in part by the history of national collecting. Artifacts from the cultural pasts of post-colonial and immigrant minorities were primarily collected by the 3 Dutch ethnographic museums, which are now merged in a Museum of World Cultures. Some creative collaboration with those collections and their curators, who have a much longer and truly collaborative history of working with local and source communities, this is a strength of anthropological museums in Holland, is a promising possibility for the Rijks, if the museum is willing to share more gallery space with the cultures of the so-called alloctonous. A few final thoughts. In ruminating on what art museums are for and how the Rijksmuseum has adjusted its mission, I've landed in a very predictable place, which is that we cannot divorce the question of what art museums are for from whom they are for, and perhaps who pay for them. In this respect, American and British institutions have something to offer their continental European counterparts. So many museums in the Anglophone West are working to connect their local communities in all their diversity more integrally to their missions, to the great works that live inside them. As terms such as learning or sharing knowledge are replacing conceptions of museum education as one-way transmission, so public engagement and partner curatorship are being substituted for the old outreach. It's challenging, but we see it happening, and I think it is no coincidence that Tom Finkelpearl, who led the Queen's Museum as it retooled itself into a genuine community resource, is New York City's new cultural commissioner. The museum's program, here represented in 3 pretty random slides, is a lively mix and mashup of great art shows, such as the recent recovery on the left of Warhol's 9 Most Wanted Men, a very, very short-lived exhibition around the time of the World Fair. So you have these great art shows on the one hand, and on the other hand, as you see on the right, community partnership exhibitions that may or may not fit the definition of a great art show, I don't know, but they are certainly huge draws that open the idea of the museum as a resource to new communities. Ultimately, an art museum's relevance and resources will flow from its ability to be interesting and worthwhile to many different constituencies, from the international to the local, from the scholarly to the amateur, and to have the perspectives and talents of those constituencies represented in its networks of partners and also on its inside, in the cohort of curators and conservators and educators that should be driving its mission. There's, of course, work to be done on that score, but I think there is also good reason for optimism. In spite of the challenges of our moment, of which we were reminded last night, America retains a culture of integration that may be the envy of Europe and Asia, with a history of educational pathways to professional diversification, and with commitments to community development that are often very baffling to Europeans. I believe personally that only an art museum that can share the effort and the joy of caring for our collective history of art with the full range of its communities will be understood to be for all of us. So that is my belief. The din and press of the crowds that you will get, the cacophony of the cafes, the rogue interpretations of the masterpiece, I may not love them, but they seem to me acceptable prices to pay for that larger good. Thank you.